All right. And we're back. Here we are.
Here we are.
I don't even know what week this is in the thing. I haven't been keeping up with, I'm not going to lie, I've been using the calendar invites for recording these to know what I'm supposed to be reading the weeks we're supposed to be reading.
Because we record ahead.
Yeah, but I don't know what week. And then I got this new Bible. I don't have my bookmark in it. I couldn't find another bookmark. So I'm all over the place.
It's all right.
Sorry about, I don't know what week it is.
We are all over the place. Everyone's the same.
We're finishing Genesis and starting Exodus.
Yeah. All right, so let's pick up. Last week, I'm sure at some point, I don't know if we finished with it, we were talking about the blessing stuff, because that's where we pick up here is, this is Jacob going to bless his two of his grandsons, Joseph's. And so you have this weird, is this too where he had him come put your hand under my thigh thing, or was that last week and we just didn't cover it? I forgot about that.
That's not.
Or
this is him, and he's putting a hand on each of his grandsons, but he crosses.
But I didn't know before that we missed the hand Joseph, on the thigh, come over close to me, let me talk to you. But so here it is. So Joseph has this idea of what's supposed to happen. He's got his two sons, his eldest in his left, Jacob's right, and then his youngest in his right.
Who Jacob has adopted. So they're taking the place of his two other sons, so they're going to receive the rights and privileges of being Jacob's sons. He says, Rachel died before she should have, so that part of my line got cut off, so they're my sons.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
and
even
he blesses them.
For the rest of the story, the 12 tribes of Israel, there is no tribe of Joseph.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's Ephraim
and
Manasseh.
So there's this weird thing where Joseph, just because I guess in cultural, what we've seen up to this point, again, this is a firstborn deal. And just Jacob, his whole thing, he was
not the firstborn.
Not the firstborn.
Right,
But he goes and he he crosses his hands.
Well, you even see, so we've seen that throughout all of Genesis. There's the firstborn is never the one who receives the covenant promise, whether it's through just that's who God chooses for whatever his reasons are, or a lot of times because of their unfaithfulness. It's always this sort of combination of God's purposes and our faithfulness or unfaithfulness. But you see sort of the echoes of what happened with Isaac and Jacob here, because it says Jacob's eyes were dimmed. Remember, whenever Jacob stole the birthright of Esau is because Isaac couldn't see. And so Jacob's eyes are dim, but he knows what he's doing.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. We're getting the glimpse of it's a counter kingdom. It's kind of his ways are not our ways. Mm-hmm. He's everybody thinks it's supposed to be like this, and we try and be like, oh yeah, this is our plan. I know what's going to happen because this is what it's supposed to be culturally, but clearly not how God works.
That's not how God works. His how he works in the world and what he values is not what we expect always. Is not our power structures. It's not what we value. And we see that from the very beginning, and it culminates in Jesus, and we still are called to live into that. I kept thinking about Paul in the New Testament letters, which we were reading last spring, him saying, why do you care about who's rich and who has status? Why are they sitting at the head of the table? That's not what the kingdom looks like. But that's not even a new concept. You see it from the very beginning.
Yeah. So then he moves into, this is Jacob speaking a blessing over each of his sons, the 12.
All the tribes.
All the tribes.
Yep. And most of them go real quick. About half of the content is devoted to two people.
Yeah.
Judah and Joseph.
Why do you think that is?
Well, Joseph, obviously, because he's the one who has saved them. But Judah, because he is the one through whom this promise, the covenant promise, will continue.
Yeah, but do you think Jacob knew that, and that's why?
Certainly. He again, I don't think Jacob could possibly have had in mind what would happen.
Yeah,
that would ultimately lead to King David, and then through that line to Jesus, and that Jesus would be the kind of Messiah that he was, and the kind of king that he was. But he does seem to know somehow that through Judah, this promise will continue.
I guess the other thing when I was reading these, I was thinking like, okay, this is Moses writing this. And so were these blessings something that would have been spoken in a way that's like, oh, this is what was said, and so this was passed down? Like, how did it get to Moses? 'Cause from when this happened to when Moses is a while.
Yeah, it was oral tradition. That's why it is so. We've talked a lot about how there's so much repetition and patterns, and the same language is used over and over again.
Yeah.
That's because this was an oral tradition. So they passed it on. They knew it. This is their history. This is their story, and they would speak it to each other.
So everyone in that
eventually it was
tribe would have
written down.
known what the blessing was
Right.
that
was their
our
identity.
line got. Yeah. Okay.
But that is why it's written in such poetic language, which for us, we're like, well, just tell us what it is.
Yeah.
Like, tell us exactly who the sons and daughters were. Don't give us, this perfect number of 70. But
Yeah.
that's because it was an oral tradition. So they had these ways of remembering and emphasizing what really mattered.
Yeah, because everything's kind of like got like there's like a metaphor here. It's like, oh, you're whatever it is.
And it's a big picture
Yeah.
story.
Yep.
It's not always in the details. The details matter for the big picture. Also, I said, and I think in maybe the first podcast or something, we're going to see all of the covenant promises that are worked out in the rest of the Bible by the time we end Genesis. So we don't see David for a while. And there's the Davidic covenant, this promise to David that his descendant will rule eternally. But you see the glimpse of it right here in 49, which is what Lance is talking about. With Judah, it's the line of Judah, the Lion of Judah, and his descendants are going to rule. And it's the first time we sort of see that begin. So we really have all of God's covenant promises, everything that Israel, the people of God, are going to hope for and sometimes lose, but know that God is faithful. All that they're wrestling with God in the Old Testament, you already see at the end of Genesis. This is really the foundation for the story. So it takes a lot of work and there's a lot of details, but now everything grows from here.
Yep.
It's worth it
So then we have
to have a 5-hour podcast.
definitely, yeah.
It's going to be a long one.
Wait, which one is?
I'm
the
just
long one?
joking.
Oh, okay. Okay, so after this, we get Jacob passes on.
Yep.
The family is kind of grieving. We get this.
He's still buried in the promised land. I think
Yeah.
that is important. That is, even though it's death, it is a reminder of the hope that this is the first place they actually own that God has promised them, and that's where he is with his people, and that's where they will end up. So
Yeah. I know you mentioned we got a napkin verse in here in 50. It's probably
yeah.
one of the first napkin verses that we probably mentioned in this season.
Yeah.
So I wonder if we need to explain that for some people.
For people who weren't with us
maybe
last year.
last year, don't know the
Probably.
napkin verses.
A napkin verse.
Um,
It's the kind of verse that would end up
it's Ted's phrase,
napkin.
which I love, which
on
is helpful.
on a napkin, but also they might end up like on Instagram
Yeah.
with a scene
Yes.
of mountains or a beach or
completely
whattever it is, and it's like,
interpreting the context.
really,
or
really
the-
well-known verses that we love
Yeah.
and
Yep.
sometimes misuse.
yeah.
Yep.
Not always.
And
but
then when
sometimes.
you're reading like we
In
are
context.
through, and you come across it, you're like, oh,
I know that verse.
that's where this comes from.
Yeah.
I've seen it.
Yeah. Okay, so
It's 50:19 if you wanted to just read it, the napkin verse.
yeah,
So his brothers, after Jacob dies, or even throughout Joseph's faithfulness and suffering and sacrifice, they're still not really sure because they know what they did.
Yeah.
They're not sure that he really has forgiven them and loves them. And so when Jacob dies, there's like, oh no, now he's gone. So Joseph's going to turn against us because of what we did to him. And he says in 50:19, but Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? Which that is a really important verse that's not really part of the napkin verse. As for you, the brothers, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. I mean, that's, what you meant for evil, God meant for good to save
Yeah.
lives. I mean, that is the napkin verse, and that's really one of the big themes of Genesis.
and the big theme of Joseph's
Joseph's
story,
story.
this whole narrative of
And the
what
whole
it is.
Bible, I would say.
Yep. And I think that really gets us into like transitioning into the next book. But before we do that, I think it's worth like recapping a little bit, like step back, like macro view, like
Genesis.
where Genesis took us.
Do you have more to say on the napkin verse?
Sorry, I was trying to move us.
No,
We got
I think she had
covered.
one.
Oh,
Well,
sorry.
I would just say this, and Lance and I talked about this
Okay.
earlier.
So you cheater?
Yeah.
No,
So that is a napkin verse because it is so important. It's a powerful theological statement. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. And that can be used to just emphasize God's sovereignty, and He is sovereign. He's in control. He will work things for good even whenever humans consistently fail, and we have seen that throughout Genesis. But it reminded me of when, if you were listening last year when we went through Romans, we were in Romans 8:28, I think is the verse, but Lance talked about, I should read it. Do you know it? I don't want to say it the wrong way. But God works all things for good
Yeah.
for those who love Him.
Yeah.
And we said that there's a interpretation that God works all things for good through
Yep.
those who love Him. It's vocational.
and the verse is, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. And there's just a lot of scholarship that has happened in the last number of years that points to this, like reading it in context and the way the words all work, that it's God is working for good through those who are part of His covenant promise. Not just for, but through.
He works through us. His purposes, His goodness is worked out through His people. That's what we're supposed to do, is we're supposed to be blessed so that we bless others. And so that verse that sometimes we look at and just think, oh, see, God is sovereign. He's going to do it. Well, really, like even you see in Joseph's story, he does it through Joseph,
Yeah.
through this representative who suffers and sacrifices, who's faithful. And then because of him, all the nation is saved.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so it's the same concept throughout the Bible. That's
Yeah.
just,
I think people probably, not people, well, I'll just say maybe me, I probably see that more as like it's a hard pill to swallow in the moment to think that like God, what evil somebody else is doing is really God's working through that evil.
he's working
Against
through
it.
it.
Yeah.
Like, so he's not,
He's not authoring it.
He's not the
or
author
authoring,
of
but
evil.
that he's working through because it's hard to see or experience. And I know that can feel like a big thing for people in a bunch of different ways,
yeah.
but that's a tough, especially in the moment. I mean, maybe easier on the backside once it's all been fulfilled and that's been
For sure.
revealed, but
we don't always get
tough,
to see. Even that. I mean, Joseph got to see the redemption, the fulfillment, but everyone who God uses in moments of suffering for the redemption of others, we don't always get to see the fruit.
Yeah.
But we can trust in the faithfulness of God and that He is working all things for good. But
Like-
through us, it's vocational.
Yeah.
Always has been. God's always calling us to participate.
Yep.
Okay, let's get to some overview before we jump into Exodus.
Okay.
First couple.
First of all,
chapters.
if you're with us, I think I'm certain there are people who have now just finished Genesis for the very first time in their life.
it's the first book of the Bible maybe they've ever read.
Read it all the way through. So if that's you, congrats.
Yeah.
Way to go. I'm
Absolutely.
sure, if it's a new rhythm or you found it challenging, keep going. It's worth it. The deal is you spend the rest of your life doing this, studying Scripture. It will change you in so many good ways. And it does, it gets easier.
Yeah, and again, we've done a lot of the foundational work for the rest of the year. We
Yep.
will continue to return to these promises and stories.
Yep. I've told all my small groups over the years that the more you understand about what's happening in Genesis, the more you understand the rest of the story, all of it.
Yeah.
It's all connected.
Well,
So
because
this is the pattern.
Yeah, I feel like so much of Genesis is really setting up. It's I'm going to tell you, like it's the glimpse of everything.
Yep.
It's the beginning of all of the world
Yeah.
and the human story.
Beginning of humanity,
It's why there's
the fall.
evil and suffering
Yeah.
in the world. It's God's promises to restore it.
Or
It's
His judgment.
It's
that
His
there's
people.
judgment. For,
I mean,
yeah.
the entire Old Testament's about the people that we just this is who the people are. This is how they came to be, and this is what God has promised them.
Yeah. I was reflecting on this morning, knowing we were going to talk about this. All right, if I'm going to pull back and try and give some kind of summary of this or what's going on. Genesis has two parts, chapters 1 through 11, and then 12 onward. 12 through 50 is the history of Israel. But Like when I think about 1 through 11, what's really happening? Two things stand out in my reflection. One, the purpose of creation. We want to read it and we talked about this earlier, but we want to like know how God did everything. That's not what's happening. It's why everything exists. So what is the purpose of creation? And in that, I think a couple of things stand out: the flourishing of creation and the flourishing of humanity. And that happens through God's partnership with humans. So like big picture, the purpose of creation is that God wants to partner with us, the one creature of all the creatures made in his image, that we can have a special bond with him, but that he then calls us to help everything flourish, everyone flourish. So macro view, that's going on. But then the second thing that stands out in my reflection is just the character of God, who he is. Like when you really stop and think about all the parts of this story, he is so creative. He is so patient. He is so gracious. I mean, yes, we have the flood and judgment and all those things, but like in it, he is preserving a remnant, because what he really wants, even after people turn and are evil, is that connection, that partnership. And so his character, what he wants is you and me. And I just had one of those profound moments, of a reminder this morning of no matter what God wants to work in me. He wants to know me, and he wants me to know him. And he has a plan for my life. And I know we talk about that, and there's a tendency in sometimes in our minds to think like God has a specific plan and it's for me in these ways. But like more broadly, God has a plan for you, but it's partnering with you so that you can be used by him to help someone else flourish, to help someone else know him, to help the world be a better place. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
If I was going to sum up without telling the stories, it's...
Yeah, and just like that is what his purpose for us is. And you also see big picture in Genesis, all the ways that we distort what his purposes are, and we reject the invitation. And even if you just look at the repetitions in Genesis, it's envy. It's I it's trying to be God instead of represent God and be with God. It's the same reasons over and over and over. And so I think that is worth sitting into. God invites us to partner with him, to be with him, to live this flourishing life of living in his blessing and blessing other people. That's what he's called us to, but we reject it because we don't trust him.
Yeah.
We're not willing to be faithful to him because we're jealous of other people, because we're trying to make things happen on our own. And what happened thousands of years ago, we still do today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at every moment, he's there waiting. Like, just come back to me. I want to pour out grace to you, and I want you to be my child, my son, my daughter. And I have a life for you that's so much better than the things you're grasping for. And
it's so much better. And also, even when we do fail, from the very beginning of this story, throughout the end of this story, he still will use us for his purposes and plans, and he's still there waiting. It's always an invitation. He is forgiving and merciful beyond what you would ever expect. He's the God who hears and sees suffering too. I mean, that's so prevalent throughout Genesis.
Yeah. I don't feel like I need to add to that.
Okay.
Sorry, I can feel you. Like,
Yeah.
let's go.
Well, no, it wasn't like I mean, I had something I was saying, but I'm like, we do need to go a little bit. All right, so Exodus.
Oh my gosh, Exodus. Here's what's going to happen. Rachel's going to say at some point, Exodus is my new favorite book. It's so good.
It's not yet.
It's not. I mean, it's getting good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's
Genesis-
not my favorite book yet, but I know.
Not my favorite book yet.
It is
Genesis.
amazing.
I mean, I know later, like as we finished last year, it was like book after book. This might be my favorite. This might be my favorite.
I know.
We
They-
got during Genesis. We got this
so
might be my
good.
favorite. So.
Yeah,
Rachel will at some point
absolutely. I
text
know.
us
I
and
know. I was
say,
really just
"This is
thinking,
my
will it
favorite."
be? We're only in
Yeah.
chapter 3. It's not yet, but maybe
Yeah.
we'll see.
Okay.
It is very, very important.
Yep. I want to start out by talking about a book I read last year. In fact, this was my favorite book I read in all of 2024. That was last year, right? We're in 25. Okay. It's from a series called Essential Studies in Biblical Theology. There's 10 books in this series. kind of biblical theology is my jam. So this is the second book in the series called Exodus, Old and New, a Biblical Theology of Redemption by Michael Morales. And it is so good. But he makes the case that Exodus from exile, not just like the Exodus, but like that is the central theme of the Scripture.
Yeah.
Of all,
I think he's
the
right. I think
whole-
he's right.
Of the whole Bible.
I mean,
and-
that's in Genesis too.
Yeah. So if you're looking for a deeper dive,
say Exodus from
let me
exile.
just read it.
What's
I'm
the?
going to read it because
It's like it was a good tagline, but I already forgot it.
Let's see.
Yeah.
I wrote
the
Exodus
problem of
from
exile.
exile.
Yeah. The problem
Yeah.
of exile. That's the central
Yeah.
issue.
All right. He would say, is there a center to biblical theology overall and to the Bible itself? And he says, yes, the central theme and story of the Bible and of history itself is the Exodus.
Yeah.
And that thread, that theme is over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And it like shows up even in Jesus himself, the Exodus from exile, like out of death and back into, he's been crucified and he's dead, and he's like the Exodus out of death and back into life.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, what that's saying. So, like, just breaking that down a little bit, like our sin separates us from God.
We're
our
in
sin
exile.
is exiled us from the presence of God, and that's ultimately what Jesus is making a way for us to have not be exiles.
That's right.
Anymore,
So-
ultimately, and then when all things are made new again, there is no more exile.
We're redeemed.
Yeah.
We're returned back into the house of our Father.
Yeah.
That's what redemption is.
I'm not trying to cheapen that. I'm just trying to put it in words.
Well,
like,
so
okay,
there's
that's-
this big
that's what that
picture
means.
concept of that's what exile is, but also understanding that this really is the central story for the Jewish people, which is that's what our Bible, I mean, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. I mean, that's the story of Scripture. This is their most identifying story. And so you see the echoes of it. You see, looking back in Genesis, you see all these, they're exiled, they're sent away, they go down. And then God pulls them out and redeems them back to him and into the land. But you see it in the story of Jesus. We talked about it.
Yeah.
I mean, these echoes of this Exodus story are all throughout the Bible. I mean, Jesus, he's born, he's threatened by a new Pharaoh type. He goes to Egypt. God calls him out of Egypt.
I mean, even the reason he goes to Egypt is because Herod is killing all the babies,
Right.
which is what happens at the beginning of Exodus.
Right.
So he flees to Egypt, and then he comes back out of Egypt. Yeah.
It's hard to, just like we said, it's hard to overemphasize the importance of Genesis 1 because that's the pattern. That's God's purposes for all of creation, for mankind. And then all of his promises you start to see in the rest of Genesis. It's also hard to overemphasize the importance of the Exodus story because you see it happen over and over again. It's cyclical in the same way. And it's what defines really what happens whenever we're unfaithful, but God's faithfulness to us, his answer to that.
And I think initially for me too, and this may be just like, not cheapening it, but like throughout Genesis, you think like the nation of Israel, like, man, it just really seems like a really big family.
Yeah.
But by the end here, and what we're reading in Exodus, like, dude, this is a significant amount of people. This is like a very large, like,
It's a nation.
yeah.
It's worth noting that
become-
when you turn your page in your Bible or your app, whatever, but you go from Genesis 50 to Exodus 1, you're looking at about 370 years.
yeah.
That's a long time. That's a lot of reproduction, a
And
lot
they
of
were
generation.
multiplying a
And
lot.
apparently-
That's how we
They were
start.
fruitful.
Yeah,
They were fruitful and they multiplied.
They were vigorous to give birth before the midwives could get there. I mean,
Right.
they were like pros. They were
These are
just
sturdy women.
yeah.
when we talked about the cycles too, I mean, you see, okay, so we just had God rescue them out of this like terrible, almost decreation event with the plague. I mean, not with the plagues, with the
famine.
With the famine. And now we're back. Oh, so they're being fruitful and they're multiplying.
Yep.
In this like sort of mini new Eden. They're not in the promised land, but God's with them and they're being blessed. And so now what happens? But it's the same language. So we're starting again.
Yeah. So they increase, and then this new Pharaoh, who's forgotten about like all that has maybe happened. It's like,
370 years
oh,
later.
dude, there's a lot of them.
Yep.
And now, like, feels threatened.
He
is
sees
what it
he
says.
sees that they're blessed,
Yeah.
and instead of wanting to participate and have a covenant with them, like we've seen other kings do, he says, "No, I'm going to destroy them."
Yeah. It's interesting. The Pharaoh doesn't have a name, and that's intentional. This Pharaoh, and then there's another Pharaoh later in the story. So the book of Exodus has two different Pharaohs, but neither one is named. And it's not, well, it's because the author is just trying to say, like, he's really the serpent character more than anything else. But
We've also said before, that we're always making a choice. We're always responding. That's another big theme throughout Genesis and Exodus. We're always responding to invitations, and the other option is to partner with. We're partnering with someone too. We're partnering with God, or we're partnering with the serpent. It's an easy way to think about it. And so this is the serpent character. He's choosing to partner with the serpent.
they're not going to give him a name. But you know who the names that show up in the story are the two midwives. Like,
I didn't see those names. Where are those?
yeah, in verse 15.
Heroines.
Oh,
The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shipra and the other Pua. Like, these ladies' names live on forever.
Yeah.
And it feels like an insignificant role probably in their lives, but their names live and Pharaoh's doesn't.
Yeah.
That's important.
They were faithful.
Yeah.
They were faithful, and they didn't participate in what the Pharaoh was doing.
Yeah. Well, and the whole, like, what we saw about, like, the seed and birth and, like, God being the author of life, they had the contrast of, like, here you have Pharaoh who's trying to, like, take
Destroy
life,
life.
and they're
Right.
They're unwilling to participate in that.
Yeah.
Evil.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so this is when we get the birth of Moses,
Yeah.
which is, again, in a season where babies, if they're born males, they're supposed to be killed.
And this is another remnant, right? We've also said that you're going to see that throughout. There's this remnant that God rescues, even whether it's persecution or falling away of the people. There's always a remnant.
And we see that he's from the house of Levi, which in Genesis, I mean, Levi's mentioned somebody. You don't hear a lot of the stories that have to do with that line, so to speak.
Yeah, so they're not priests. They're a priestly line. So
Yeah.
they don't have land because he did forfeit his right to that land because of his violence. But they're the priest who serve throughout, or they will be the priest who serve throughout the nation.
Yep. So as you start reading Exodus, here's another just like a little helpful tool. It has two movements, and they repeat each other. The first is the story of Moses. So I learned this from Carmen Imes, who is an Old Testament scholar, and Exodus is her favorite book. She's written a couple of books about bearing the image of God and the name of God. So check those out. Carmen Imes is great, but I can show you here so you can see. But these are the two parts: Moses being delivered in this mini ark through the water with the reeds. And then he's called by God and commissioned. That's the first movement. And then after this, it's the same story of Israel. Israel is delivered through the sea of reeds, and then taken to a mountain, and they're commissioned as his people. So it's the story of Moses replayed out in the story of Israel. Those are the two big pieces of this book. Yeah.
That's right.
How come nobody ever talks
those
about that?
patterns are so well, and I think reading this just straight through like this is so helpful because it's easier to see those patterns.
Yeah.
Just like we said, I mean, it's also similar to the Joseph story. I mean, there's all these pattern and language, which helps us to see the big picture of what God is saying to us.
Yeah. I think we've heard about it before in back where, like, God hears the cries of his people in Genesis, and we get that a little bit again here that It says during 20, this is 2:23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew.
Yeah.
He remembered.
It's just like, and God knew. Like,
God
he
knew.
didn't, we don't got to explain it. He just knew.
Well, I do. Whenever we do read that God remembered his covenant, I hope that's obvious, but it's not that he forgot.
Yeah.
It's not that he wasn't there. That's this moment, okay, he's going to act. This is a purposeful, active remembering.
Yeah.
This is the time.
So then Moses, because he ends up killing a dude.
Yep. Okay.
and-
There we go.
Yeah.
Another hero who is also a murderer,
Murderer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And buries him in the sand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and then runs away
And then
because
runs
he
away.
doesn't want
Don't
to
be
deal
held
with it.
accountable, yeah.
Yeah. So we kind of went over it really quickly,
Sorry.
but
Oh, we're in the Prince of Egypt movie now.
yeah,
Prince
now
of
we're in
Egypt,
Prince of
Prince of
Egypt. Yeah.
Egypt.
So Moses, as a baby, his life is spared because his mom obviously doesn't want him to die. She keeps him as long as she can, and then realizes this crying baby, someone's going to find.
Yeah.
They're going to throw him into the river. So they make the word here. This little thing is an ark. It's the ark like from Noah. It's the same Hebrew word, and so he's put in this mini ark and placed among the reeds, and he sails into Pharaoh's house. Think of it
Yeah.
that way. Like the deliverer is sent into enemy territory, into Pharaoh's house, and then raised there. Actually, sent back home to be nursed, if you
Yeah.
catch that part of the story. But then ends up growing up in Pharaoh's house. But all along, he's an outsider. Likely looks different than the Egyptian people he's around.
And the
And-
Israelites.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it has to be that at some point he feels like it's his responsibility to deliver his people. And he doesn't know how
He
that.
doesn't know how.
He doesn't know how. And
So he tries to do it on his own.
on his own
through
way.
Yeah.
violence.
Yeah.
And that never works out.
Yeah.
Yep. But then he ends up
But
in
God
his
works
travels,
all things for good through those who are his
Yeah.
people.
which is kind of a throwback to some of these all these weird interactions at the watering station. Well,
Yeah.
when people are
Ted.
away
Yes!
somewhere else,
That's
you
so
know.
fun. He finds his wife at a
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
We have seen that over and over again, haven't we?
Yeah. So, but
Maybe
I
that's
mean,
why people go to bars.
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah, that's what I say. They're at the watering hole.
Yeah.
But he ends up, he gets his wife, and then this is where he's kind of called out.
And this is just even these two things together. So God provides a wife, and then God commissions him for his purposes.
Yeah.
So because part of the promise is that I'm using you as my people for redemption, but that is going to require a nation of people, the seed, to continue.
Yeah.
So it's always both of those things connected.
Which again, up to this point, you're right. Maybe he did feel like he was supposed to rescue in some, like he had some, because he felt some responsibility.
Yeah,
like when
that's what he said. He
looked
saw
out.
them being abused, and then
he felt tried to take matters into his own hand, but he hadn't been really called or commissioned yet. You know, he didn't.
Well, it's one of those moments that you're like, I'll do this because something needs to be done. But whenever we actually wait on God and submit to his plans, because Moses doesn't even want to do that at first, he always says something way bigger and better and more complete than what we could ever have imagined or done on our own.
Yeah. So then we get this burning bushing, which again, I think is one of those things people think probably like, dude, this is like a crazy story. Like people who don't believe, like, dude, a bush, it's like on fire, but it's not burning. Like what? Like you actually believe that happened? Or is this just like did that actually happen? Or is that just, oh no, it's like a metaphor for some, so, you know, I think people who are new to faith may be like, dude, that's a weird thing.
Yeah.
So, but it actually happened.
Again, yeah, it actually happened. And the fire is important because God's presence there shows up as fire. And that's going to continue through the rest of this story. He will lead the people as a pillar of fire
Yeah.
at night. And
So I
And
think
a
you can
voice.
say both things. You could say it is illustrative of something. So it symbolizes God's presence. Fire does, because remember the first time we saw that was with his covenant, God's covenant with Abraham. This fire went through the pieces that were cut. That was the
Yeah.
presence of God. And we know that that's the presence of God because it was fire. And you see that again here, and then you'll continue to see it. So it does illustrate the presence of God, but that it did also happen. It
Yeah.
can be both.
Yeah. I mean, we end in 3, and so this is
We're kind of halfway through the moment
yeah.
that's happening.
So I mean,
Yeah.
he basically goes in and is like, he's not looking, and the voice tell him like, okay, take off your stuff, and then he says like, hey, here's what's gonna happen. He's like,
Yeah.
but who are you? And
You have something. When he says take off your shoes, you're standing on holy ground. Like, think about that for a moment. Just before that was just a regular place,
yeah,
right? A regular bush, a regular piece of ground. But when God's presence showed up, now there's something different about it.
yeah,
His presence makes this place holy, makes this place unlike it was before. And I don't know, I've thought about that at different times in my life where like just the very presence of God changes a place. And as I like reflect on that, I get all the way down to when Jesus talks about himself being the temple, and then he says his spirit goes in and now we're temples. And it's like, if all this is true, then God's very presence in me somehow makes me holy, but changes me.
yeah,
And that's not true, like just for me, that's for you and for every person listening. The very real presence of God that was burning as a bush and made ground holy makes you holy. And you think that like about your life, like I'm not holy. I'm not.
yeah,
Yet now the presence of God this should teach us something.
It's the only thing that makes us holy.
That's right.
The presence of God.
That's right. And there should be
I
some
think we
reverence.
think we have to be holy to be in the presence of God.
There
but
you
it's,
go.
But he makes us holy, and then in his presence we become holy.
Yes. Yeah.
He sanctifies us through his presence, which is what Jesus gives us, is the presence of God.
Yep. And
We're just getting excited now.
I know.
Yeah.
Gosh, we could
Well,
really get
we're
going.
gonna have we need to wrap it up,
Okay.
and we're in this kind of weird spot. Like I don't know like how we want to end.
Well,
it for
Moses
this week,
is like
but-
he's like Abraham. He's this unlikely guy. He seems unlikely. He's sort of like, okay, so God's prepared him in all these ways, even though it's suffering and it's confusing. But he's just this guy, and God's saying, okay, I'm gonna use you, because remember with Abraham,
He's
you
this
are gonna
guy
have
who's
all
killed
these
someone.
descendants. Right? He's killed someone.
murder.
Now he's in exile.
Yeah.
He himself is in exile. And God says, okay, I'm going to use you to redeem all the people.
Yeah.
And Moses is like, what are you talking about? How can this be true? I mean, it just reminds me of the Abraham story. So many stories. How can that be true? And it's only when we finally get to just trusting that God is faithful, that he will do what he says, that it actually happens. But he's in this wrestling moment.
Yeah.
Is he going to trust God and participate in God's plans of redemption?
Yeah, and specifically, this is God's given him direction, a call to take the people out of Egypt and take them back up to the land that he's given them. I mean, that's
It's a very
what-
specific plan.
Yeah.
And Moses is still like, but.
Yeah. It's like,
How?
well, who is it that I should say? Like
Yeah.
he's trying to like figure
right.
all this stuff out. Like, what's happening here?
Right. If I roll
Who
in
are
and
you?
tell all these people the Elohim,
Mm-hmm.
right? The spiritual being has sent me. Like, who are you? Who
Yeah, who is he and who are you?
sending me? And it's this. I heard it once described like the depth of what happens here, like spiritually, theologically. You can mine it for the rest of your life and still not figure it all out. What God is saying about who He is.
Yeah.
But he's basically says like, I am the one who is, who has always been, and always will be. And you can tell people like, I am the one, and that's who.
Yeah.
That's who I am. That's
I am
who
him.
sent you.
Yep.
You just go say He is the one.
Yeah.
I mean, because you're saying this is sort of like this cliffhanger moment that we're ending on, I mean, it's good for me personally to end in a place like this because, like Lance said, he sees this miracle, this burning bush, is the very presence of God, which is holy. So he's in the holy presence of God. God is calling him, inviting him to be his representative, because he says, I'm going to redeem the people, you go, which is what he always says. I'm going to do it, you go do it. That's what it always is. And Moses isn't sure. He's questioning it. He's not sure. So it's this unlikely person who's called by God, who's in his very presence, and he's not sure. So we have the same invitation.
Yeah.
We have the same invitation. God invites us into his very presence to be transformed and then participate in his kingdom. But it still requires trust, this complete faith and surrender. We have to say yes. We still have the choice.
Yeah, still connected to what we talked about wrapping up Genesis, like this, what he wants for you. And he says to you and me the same thing he said to Moses, I will be with you. That's what he wants. He wants to be with you and to lead you into his purposes.
Can you imagine if we trusted him? If we said, okay, he really will be, I believe he is with me, and I will surrender to whatever he's going to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great things.
And I'm willing to bet that for most, if not all of us, if we really sat down prayerfully, thoughtfully, and reflecting on this, like, what does God want from me? Some radical things would come to your mind.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a challenge, just, in life in general. People be like, well, yeah, he got a burning bush and God's voice told him exactly what to do. It's like, I haven't gotten a burning bush. I haven't got clear. So even trying to discern, like, what is that? Like discerning the what God's calling you to.
I would just, this is my caution for myself. So this is for me.
Yeah.
Is it true that you don't know, or do you not really want to know?
Yeah.
Because you're not sure if you're ready to surrender to that. Yeah. Because I think that that's true, that if we actually sincerely pray, God says, this is what I want. Go and trust me.
Yeah.
He will put it on your heart.
And so what I was going to say is I think sometimes it's often like we also then think it's like the vending machine, like, oh, I'm going to pray and ask God to do this, and then he's going to tell me. But it's like, it may not always be revealed every time. Like it's not always a right away thing, I guess.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it was a long time for Joseph.
Yeah.
This is a long road for Moses too, and it's not an easy road ever.
Yeah. And you got to remember, here it is, a murder. Like, to think that, oh, well, I've somehow disqualified myself from being used by God, that he has a plan that he wants to work in and through me, or some. So
yeah, man, we say regularly that, or at least try to say, there's nothing in your life, no sin that has you outside the reach of the grace of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Right? You can be forgiven by just accepting that forgiveness and turning toward him. In the same way, you have not done something that has you outside the reach of God's plan and purpose for your life. Mm.
Yeah, very much.
God works best through those who are humbled before him. That's when he can really use us. His strength is made perfect in our weakness, because that's when we recognize, well, it's not us. We can't build a tower to heaven. We can't do it on our own. But if we recognize our brokenness and we're humble before God, that's when he really starts working.
Yeah. All right, well, next week we'll pick it back up.
This is my favorite book.
No!
Well, thank you for listening to the Bible Reading Recap Podcast. Remember, as we read and reflect on God's Word together, we're growing in our commitment to be a people of hope, with our one heart fully surrendered to Jesus. You can subscribe to receive additional resources to help you study the story of Scripture at clearcreekresources.org. We'll see you next week.